45.
Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
All across the fantasy universe, welcome one and all to a Friday happy hour edition of the Fantasy Football Hustle, powered, of course, by Pro Football Focus. I'm your host, Brian Drake of FightingChanceFantasy.com, and I'm joined, as always, by my main man. It's PFF Senior Fantasy Analyst Dwain McFarland. Dwain, how are you on this Friday?
I'm doing excellent, Drake. It is, it's the news season. Had a little brief lull. Well, we had the combine last week, but now everything's breaking loose. We got the combine stuff done. You got new mock drafts starting to come out. Free agencies hitting. Deshaun Watson. We got legal stuff going on. So, man, just so many storylines. It's a lot to go through. Lots to talk about.
Yeah, if you're looking for the best stuff on Deshaun Watson, our friend Drew Davenport at Drew FBG Auctions, I would recommend you go follow his stuff. Besides all the good guys over at PFF also, you can find out a lot of great information on Watson there. That's not what we're going to be talking about today, as we're going to kind of dive into the running backs, especially the running backs who are going to make up this 2022 rookie class. And we all know that running backs are the lifeblood of fantasy football. Every draft seems to be all about hoarding the best of the bunch and praying one of them works out. So today we're going to discuss that 2022 rookie class, and we're going to use Dwain's rookie running back tiers article as our baseline. So as we prepare for these drafts and best ball contests, it's imperative that we know the skill sets of these backs. It's also paramount that you have the best information at your fingertips. You can get that over at pff.com. Use promo code HUSTLE. Save 25% off a subscription for 2022. That means the NFL Draft Guide, which you'll see today, fantasy rankings, the grades, the locked articles, all the incredible content you come to know and love from the smart guys over at pff.com, available 25% off with promo code HUSTLE. So, Dwain, as we talk running backs, let's take a second and kind of step back and say, on paper, this doesn't seem to be the most exciting or deep class of difference-making running backs, and we're probably not going to have a Jonathan Taylor or a Najee Harris type back from this group, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're punting on everyone either. Now, rookies have shown that they can come in and produce right away for fantasy football, and that's what we're here for. You guys listening want to know how these players are going to impact fantasy football season next year. Last year, for instance, we saw Najee Harris. He finished as PPR running back 3. Fellow rookie Javonte Williams finished as RB15 in a total timeshare, and in limited work, DeAndre Swift finished 16th on the season. They were the only 3 rookies to finish in the top 25 in PPR scoring, though. So there are many different paths to success, Dwain. We just hope one of these guys land in a really good spot. So kind of break down to the folks before we get going how you looked at these tiers, what metrics you might have used to say, hey, this is how I want to rank X, Y, and Z in terms of my rookie running backs.
Sure. And I think you did a good job of kind of the way you set it up. There's not a Jonathan Taylor in this class. There's not anyone that even ranks as high as Javonte Williams did for me last year. Now I've changed a little bit. How I'm doing my projections for running backs and my tiers now that I have, more information, from Pro Football Focus and more time. Now, some of these metrics, just so people are clear, from a college standpoint at PFF, we've been collecting the data on, the college players since 2014. So that means anybody that has come out, since then, we at least have one season. But if you want to look at being able to look at a full career for a player in college, 2017, is really the first year where you would have at least 4 years, right, for a player that played all 4 seasons. You could, theoretically have a 2015 player that only played 3 years and came out as a junior, but I made the cutoff basically 2017, bringing it for the college, for the new stats. Like now we still have the other stuff, like we have data real far back, right, as far as yards per game and all that kind of stuff. So just know that I'm not saying that these things are hyper predictive or anything yet when I talk about the PFF stats, but I wanted to layer them in as context And I did do some research on them. And right now, I mean, I think I pulled in the ones that I think are promising. Will we know if they really correlate well to fantasy success? Not for a few more years. We'll have to continue to collect data on it. But like early on, like it looks good. And in fact, if folks want to see like one example of that, the explosive runs. So those are carries of 10 yards or more. I put out a tweet a couple of days ago, just looking at the threshold of all the top backs that at least had broken, had hit the 20% mark, meaning 20% of their carries in college over their career went for 10 yards or more. And so the list looks like a list of, that's like your first litmus test for any kind of, new threshold or stat that you may be looking at, is that when you look at it, like who's on the list? Well, it's Darrell Henderson, Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, Rashad Penny, Kennedy Brooks, kind of a surprise, Joe Mixon, Pierre Strong Jr., Devonta Swift, Dalvin Cook, Michael Carter, Jonathan Taylor, Devin Singletary. So you can see pretty good list. Not every back, Rashad Penny has been hurt. Devin Singletary just really broke out last year, but still overall, that's a pretty good list. So I don't have enough data to say that, yeah, this is something that, we can really run all this data against to say that there's a super high correlation to fantasy value, but early on, again, it's looking good. So I'll layer those things as well.
Okay.
And like, I'm super excited to look at that kind of data versus like 40 times.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at NFL data, which I have longer, I have since 2006, and I can look at explosive run rates. That's the other thing behind these. I do know that they matter and that, they are pretty sticky year over year. So it would make sense that with college and coming from college to the pros, that it would be the same. But we always have to make sure, right? Is that something that usually translates for a back from college to pros? So anyway, just wanted to throw that context out there. But other than that, we're looking really for, I chose a few different things to focus on based on just running these correlations versus the first 3 years fantasy points per game for these backs. And so projected draft capital is number one, always is. So for right now, the way I have this built is using grinding the mocks. So based on what pick that we've got these players going, that's what I'm using right now to build the tiers. Once we get the actual data point on where they get drafted, a lot of these players will move, right? And so knowing that draft capital is number one, you could have somebody today that I don't even have ranked in the first 3 tiers that could jump up. But I tried to name the tiers in a way that folks could get an idea of what might happen to someone if they got better draft capital. So for example, I broke it into tier 1 would be an early day 2 pick with a great production profile. And maybe I should have said good production profile. It's not great like what we saw with Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, but really good profiles. Then the tier 2 would still be a day 2 pick, maybe not as early, that still had a solid production profile, not as good as the first tier, and so on. So I keep continuing to break those down. Then you get into the late day 2, early day 3 picks, but they had limited production. So we're expecting some draft capital, but they weren't great in college. That's their own tier, right? And then you got the next tier, which is we're really not seeing much buzz around them as far as draft capital goes. But these guys also had similar production to some of the guys in the second tier that we're going to talk about. Maybe not quite as good, but still pretty good production. If all of a sudden they were to get draft capital behind them, those are some of the guys that could really move up. So I won't exhaust it reading the name of every tier, but just know I tried to group the players in that way so that as things evolve and as we get more information, the main thing that's going to change here is really just the draft pick, right?
Yep.
The combine stuff we could get some pro day information, but just know that the combine and pro day stuff does not weight very heavily at all. The biggest correlation for the combine stuff, 2 things. 1, 40 time, because 40 time what? It equates to NFL draft capital. If you go look over on PFF, Kevin Cole wrote a great article on this last week.
He's been killing it.
Feels like last year, maybe, because we have so many things happening. And he's put out a lot of other great content. But what it shows is the NFL overvalues the 40 time as far as draft capital goes, even though it may not mean a lot to an NFL team from a WAR perspective, wins above replacement. So that makes sense. There's a correlation between those 40 times, right, and some of those draft picks. The thing I weight the most after draft capital is really production. Then you get the combine stuffs. And I kind of talked about like that really there's a loop kind of going on between some of the combine metrics. The one other thing, Timo Risk put out a really good article this week talking about true 40 times. And he talked about really the correlation between, basically you could take the combine and break it down to 3 drills. And those 3 drills would really tell you enough about a player. And we're probably honestly trying to look at too many things whenever we're looking across 6 or 7 drills. And one of the examples that he talks about is players that, have a really good broad and have a really good vertical, typically also have a really good 40. So you get a guy like, who was it? Kevin Harris, for example. Kevin Harris had a broad jump of 126, vertical of 38.5, didn't run in the 40-yard dash. But based on those two numbers, we should know that he's going to have a good shot at running a good 40. So I have him a little higher than what I see a lot of other folks have him for some other reasons as well. But the main thing is I think there's a good chance that he grabs some draft capital and moves up. And we'll talk about him more in a minute.
Yeah, and there's a couple of guys that I plucked out of your tiers here who maybe didn't run the best or perform the best on some of the leaps and jumps at the combine. But
we've seen many styles of players. So for example, LaShawn McCoy, I mean, you're an Eagles fan. He did not blow out the 40. I think there's two archetypes of backs, right? There's really those backs that depend more on the explosiveness and that speed. And then there are the backs that rely really more on the quickness. And if you look at LaShawn McCoy, he's a great example. He did come back later and he ran a great 3-cone time of 6.82, even though his 40 was like a 4.55. I don't have it right in front of me. It was somewhere right around there.
It was, yeah.
Now his broad was okay. His broad jump was okay. But some of these players, so for example, and we'll talk more about it, but Isaiah Spiller, a 114 broad and a 30-inch vertical, probably not going to run really fast in the 40. But the trump card for him would be coming out, because none of the backs did agility drills at the combine. One of the things that could happen for him is he comes out and he runs like a 6.8 in the 3-cone, right? That would be big news for Isaiah Spiller.
Well, let's start things out here with the man who topped your list of tiers at PFF.com, and that's Iowa State's Breece Hall. He's 6'1", 200 pounds. He played 3 years for the Cyclones, amassing over 4,500 rushing yards. Has a nose for the end zone, which we like in fantasy, scoring 20 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. What I really love about Hall, he touched the ball 590 times over the last 2 years, which is the most of any back in the nation. At the combine, he was clocked at 4.39 in the 40, which is great for a back his size. Again, 6'1", 200 pounds. And over at Dynasty League Football, they have Hall coming off the board in Dynasty rookie mocks at 104. Now, he's typically the first back off the board. I also looked at Fantasy Mojo, Dwayne, who does a lot of our high stakes ADP. And Hall was at running back 18 in the middle of round 4. In the latest best ball mocks. So what do you love about Hall's game, and how do you think he translates to the NFL level? Maybe any comps you have on him too.
Yeah. So looking at Hall, is there a way, do you care can I share my screen real quick?
You can.
Yeah, let me share.
But this is, again, you folks, you need to be following us on YouTube at Fantasy Football Hustle. We're showing the draft guide right now, and we can take that down and I can put up Dwayne's.
It won't be as pretty as the draft guide, and if you need to toggle back and forth, you can.
Sure.
But this is kind of the back end work for what I did, and I'll blow it up here for folks so they can see it a little better. Because I like the color coding, right? The color coding starts to tell you the story, and blue means the marks were really good. The more red they are, the worse that the player performed. Now notice, like, I've got broad jump and vertical in here and 10-yard split, not something that I really put into the model, but knowing the work that Timo did kind of helps us think about, okay, is this 40 legit, right? Or is this, maybe the 40 is better than what we thought, or they didn't run, but what do we think is going to happen, with the 40-yard dash, because it correlates so much, again, to draft picks. So if you look at Breece Hall, you got 2 backs that are pretty much green across the board, and it's Breece Hall and it is Kenneth Walker. And so with Breece Hall, though, we've got that true career yards per game. If we wanted to look at best, season yards per game, which is something I also look at, but I can't put everything into the chart. There's other things that go into the model, but I tried to pick the things just to let people look at here. So if you look at the career, Breece Hall's at 129, and that's what differentiates him. He's also projected to go higher. He's also got a better shot of potentially climbing into the end of the first round. Again, not a Jonathan Taylor. This is not a Christian McCaffrey. So, for example, if you look at one of the biggest things, right, is really the production. And so if you look at him, nice job as a freshman, 1,140 total yards, 1,140 total team yards, 28%. Then he added another 1,700 yard season, 1,766, and then a 1,743. And those were 35 and 37%, which you see here. His best yardage was 37%. His best season from total touchdowns, 50% of the team. Explosive rush rate, a little bit lower, but you heard me give the example earlier with all the guys that were above 20. There were also a bunch of guys that were below that were in this 14, 15 range, and the hit rate wasn't as good if you were down here. But if you had all these other things and then you had this, it wasn't really a big issue, right? So again, a lot of that ties back to draft capital. So with Hall, he, like we said, he's not on the same level as some of the guys that we've seen in the last couple of years, but still really strong across the board. And like you mentioned, the 40, when he came out and ran that in the 40 and then backed it up with the broad jump and the vertical. And so we know that's probably an accurate time. Like, he's in a really good spot. Also, career avoided tackles per attempt, 31%. So this is not as predictive of a stat, but it's more just gives you context to the player. And you can see these three top guys, like, look how high they are versus this next tier of backs in tier 3 that you see. But the difference between Hall and Walker is really the career yards per game. Kenneth Walker, first 3 seasons, didn't do anything, transfers over to Michigan State, and all of a sudden he has this one huge blow-up year. If Kenneth Walker had really posted 2 great years, it would be a little different for me, and looking at the way that Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall compare, if that makes sense.
All right, I like that. Let's keep it moving here. We'll move over to our next running back, and that, of course, is the aforementioned Kenneth Walker. And I think that's the name that most fans have heard over and over during this draft season. It's Kenneth Walker III of Michigan State. So Walker, like you just mentioned, Dwayne, took over the Spartans backfield in 2021 after transferring from Wake Forest after his sophomore season. 5'10", 210-pound Walker had some monster showings, including a 5-touchdown game against Michigan, and he broke 20 tackles on 27 carries against the Hurricanes this year. It's unbelievable. He ran a 4.38 at the combine, which is perfectly fine for a back, especially of his size. Now, in best ball, his ADP is running back 30. That'll probably change depending on his team. And he's coming off the board. He's pretty much RB2 in most dynasty, rookie drafts that I've seen. So now he's a monster between the tackles, Dwayne, which I love, especially NFL teams love. Led the nation in yards after contact, but he gets knocked for his pass pro. In the PFF draft guide, they were quoted as saying he protects like he doesn't want to get hurt. So now we know pass pro can keep rookies off the field. So with his limited work as a pass catcher and the issue around pass pro, what do you think of Walker and his pro prospects going forward?
Yeah, just not very involved in the receiving game. And I didn't watch like specifically him in his pass blocking, and I didn't look at the grade just because it doesn't correlate that the pass blocking grade. And it goes back to 2014, but it doesn't correlate super strongly. But what we do know is backs that don't really catch the ball in college typically don't catch the ball in the NFL. Mm-hmm. So there is a direct correlation between that. And so if you look at, fantasy points, thinking into the future and you're thinking of a PPR league, it obviously would matter more than like a half-point PPR. But what I want to say is he did appear fine catching the ball at the combine. Remember, with a lot of these guys, there's not very many backs, Drake, that truly can be that sticky type of receiving back. And those are the backs that can really run routes at all levels of the field. Not so much deep, but they can also work intermediate and underneath against the linebackers and the safeties. Those are typically the guys that we see continue year after year to always be incorporated into their passing game. Then you have another tier of backs, which pretty much all of them are in, which is catching swing passes, check down passes. You don't have to be as talented. They're not asking you to run like a bunch of angle routes and bullet routes and out and ups, all these different types
Everything's
of things.
From the
wheel
spread.
Routes.
They don't ask these guys to do that anymore in college.
Well, right. But a lot of these guys, the ones that are really sticky they do all of that. But with the rest of the league, like really what it comes down to is, do you have 2 or 3 other options that you're throwing the ball to all the time or not? Mm-hmm. If you don't, if you only have one other option, then guess what? The backs are probably going to be pretty involved in the passing game, even if it's all behind the line of scrimmage, because you've got to manufacture yards some way through the air. So it really just matters where Kenneth Walker lands. If he lands on a loaded team, it's got a bunch of other weapons that work down the field where it's just going to be more profitable, right, to throw the ball to receivers and tight ends, probably not going to be very involved in the passing game. But if he lands on a team that only has one other weapon or 1.5 weapons, maybe 2 weapons, he could still be he could be fine. We saw this with A.J. Dillon, right? He's not like this great route runner or anything, but you throw him in the flat, let him catch the ball. He can do that. And Green Bay is a great example of that. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon stay involved. All you really have is Devontae Adams. Everybody else is just really a tertiary piece. There's no true secondary option. It's kind of spread out across a bunch of guys. So that's what's going to happen with Kenneth Walker. The encouraging things like the bright points around him. His best touchdown share is 54%. Best yardage share season was 42%. So that 42% actually, and if you want to click back over on the other screen, people can see the 42%. You'll see there's only one other player that ranked that even had a season like that, and that was Hassan Haskins. Hassan Haskins has all these other holes in his game that we don't see with Kenneth Walker. So really looking across the board, like blue is good. Like, and he's hitting blues on all these, coming out and running that 4.38 and the 40, really cemented, where we're going to see him go. And honestly, and we talked about him already, Drake, but like he is the back that I'm pounding absolutely right now when I get any time to do best ball drafts, because I think he's the guy that as soon as it comes out and he's the first or second back taken, we're going to see him move up a ton in these best ball drafts and season long drafts, because right now Breece Hall's already going in the 4th and 5th round. Right. So people already expect it, and he's going to continue to creep up. But remember, we talked about this last time. Jonathan Taylor, he started off in the lead pole position as a rookie 2 years ago. Didn't really move up through the preseason. Then the next year we got to it, and it was Najee Harris. Now, he did move up 12 spots because he landed somewhere we knew he would really be the bell cow. But if you look behind that, Javonte Williams never really moved up, even after his draft capital came through, just based on, where his landing spot was. But a lot of these guys that start off really high don't move up as much. Now, if Breece Hall were to get picked in the middle of the first round for some reason, he's definitely going to move up boards. But if he lands in an approximate range, early second round of where we have him here, I don't know how much more he'll move. Kenneth Walker is going to move up, period.
Yeah, that's why we love doing these shows, because if you guys are doing best ball drafts on Underdog or FFPC or wherever you're doing them, like this is the kind of stuff you need to know. Everybody else is just taking their 58th wide receiver at that point. You want to pick off guys who could be starting wide receivers or starting running backs in the league for you. All right, let's keep moving it along here with the next man on the list, and it's Texas A&M junior Isaiah Spiller, 6'1", 215, put up nearly 3 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons in College Station. You've got him much higher in your personal tiers than PFF has them on their, quote, big board. He didn't test all that well in the jumps, as we mentioned earlier at the Combine, but last time I checked, nobody's asking their running back to hurdle Aaron Donald on the regular. He's still a very young kid. He's not even legal drinking age yet, so the sky could be the limit for him. Best ball drafters like him in the FFPC best ball drafts coming off as the second running back behind Breece Hall. He's going in the 7th round. So you'll see between Spiller and Kenneth Walker, they're kind of flip-flopping who's going to go off the board second. Many scouts seem to like his hands and ability to play on all 3 downs. So why are you so much higher on Spiller than the rest of the PFF crew?
Well, I mean, I think, just from a pure like big board standpoint, like I get, where they are with Spiller. And so I'm not really debating it. What we're looking for from a fantasy value is I like the players that have also been involved, in the passing game. Only going to be 21 years old next season when, we get his rookie season, he'll be 21.1 years old next September, whenever we kick off, the NFL season. So he'll be the youngest back from this class. And if you, looking back at that chart that I had up, the other thing you'll notice is the 3 guys that are at the top. Look at them: 21.3, 21.9, 21.1. And that's why I don't worry about it as much about showing breakout ages and stuff on all of this, because it's a lot of it's built in to look at these guys coming out early, right? You got these guys coming out early, and we're projected to go in the top 100 picks. That's really what we're looking for. And right now, his draft capital is 69. So that's really where the biggest difference comes between me and where the PFF big board has him. If all of a sudden we see in the next couple of weeks, Drake, as we get tighter mock draft information post combine, and as we start to get better, more concrete information about what some of these teams are going to do, if he slides down into that 100, draft pick range, that's definitely going to hurt him, and he'll fall into, he might fall into a tier of his own. I have to think about the way I want to do it, because technically it would probably deserve to go to tier 4, because tier 3 is really this whole different, like, going to have draft capital but hasn't performed a lot. So most likely I would just make it Breece Hall tier 1, tier 2 Kenneth Walker, tier 3 would be Isaiah Spiller. If all of a sudden we thought Spiller was going to be picked in the same range as like Zamir White, James Cook, Brian Robinson, and those guys. But Spiller, man, I mean, got the weight, 217. Right now, the draft capital still looks strong. Career yards per game, 103. So it's good to see him over the 100-yard mark. He never had like this huge season where he had 45, 50% of, the team's rushing attempts or the team's total combined yards, like we've seen with some of these guys in the past, like Jonathan Taylor and so on. But it was still solid, and he had a good season early. And so when you look at Spiller, he's one of the few guys to actually, by the age of 20, already have accounted for over 20% of his team's yards. And he did that as a freshman at Texas A&M. And like I said, over his career, 103 yards. So he just checks a lot of boxes. The broad jump and the vertical are going to definitely hurt because his 40 is probably going to be bad. Now he could surprise us with his 40, but I would really be surprised unless he was hurt or something. We just don't know all the information. If he came out and retested in all three of those things and looked really good, or again had a good 3-cone time, then I think we could see his ADP really firm up, or his NFL mock draft value firm up. But if he comes out and he doesn't perform well in any of those things in his pro day, he could continue to slide.
Georgia won the national title, and they did so thanks to a pair of talented backs in Zamir White and James Cook. You have both Bulldogs in your third tier of runners. These two split carries and were both exceptional whenever they touched the ball. Zamir White led the team in rushing with 856 yards and 11 touchdowns on the ground. James Cook added 728 yards rushing, but was much more of a threat as a receiver. Cook caught 27 balls for an average of 10.5 yards per reception, scored 4 more times through the air. It seems to me, Dwain, that James Cook is getting much more draft hype, and PFF's big board has him well above White. But you're more bullish on Zamir White and his skill set. Tell me more about the two Bulldog teammates.
Well, one thing you have to take into account whenever you have two players, and Kevin Cole, this is another thing, that he had mentioned, and I've seen some other people, I don't know how they put it into their equation as far as formula goes, but, and I'm kind of doing it. I don't have a mathematical way that I'm doing it right now. I'm just approximating it. Basically, I'm looking, do they have a teammate that's also projected to go right around within the first 100 picks, right? Meaning in the first 3 rounds of the draft. And if you're playing with another teammate in your own backfield, then it stands, to argue like, look, NFL teams think enough of both of these players. They just ate into each other's production. So we can't ding them as bad for their career yards per game or their percentage of their team's total yards, or even if you wanted to do, yards per team play, which is another really interesting, metric that we could get into some more. But all of those things are going to be lower for these backs that have to share time. Brian Robinson's another example. I mean, he played with Najee Harris. He's played with multiple really good backs in front of him. Now, you would have liked to have seen him overcome those players. But at the end of the day, if the draft capital is going to be there from the NFL, and so Robinson right now is mocking at 107, Zamir White at 99, James Cook at 106. Like those 3 backs, I kind of put all together in the way I think about them. Dameon Pierce, he had LaMichael Pirine, that's getting more borderline. Pirine wasn't a top 100 pick or anything like that. So Pierce, I'm a little more worried about, but really was Zamir White, James Cook, Brian Robinson. None of them did anything super spectacular in production from college. None of them did anything really spectacular. Well, I take that back. Zamir White crushed the combine. 40, he's 214 pounds, ran a 4.4. His 10-yard split, 1.50, broad jump, 128, vertical, 33.5. So at his size, coming from a big program like Georgia, where you played with another back, that's really good. But career yards per game just aren't going to look good. 59, 23% of the team's yards is his best year. James Cook only 19%. So really, White did himself a big favor with the combine. I think we could see him rise a little bit, but he's probably going to be he should be in the top 100 picks. Is going to be my guess. James Cook, obviously the younger brother of Dalvin Cook. So he's got the NFL bloodline going for him, but that doesn't always translate. Now, the thing I want to say about Cook, career explosive rush rate, 19%. He just missed that 20% mark. So he is one of the more explosive backs in the class. If I kind of scroll down for you guys, you can see there are only 2 other backs that are ahead of him. Kennedy Brooks and Pierre Strong Jr., who we'll talk about in a minute, were the only 2 ahead of him. Kenneth Walker and Isaiah Spiller were both pretty good at 17 and 16%, but James Cook, 19%. Good 40 time, 4.42. Okay, broad jump. He's a little lighter, 199 pounds. So he's not somebody that's going to, we'd like it to be 210, 215 in that range. But he could also be somebody that serves as a passing down option. So all these guys, a lot of it's about capital and the fact that they played with other good players, except for Rachaad White. So if you want to hit Rachaad White, and then we can come back to him, and I'll talk about it.
It just so happens that Rashad White is the next guy up, and you're higher on your board than most. It's Arizona State bruiser Rachaad White, 6'2", 210. Only had one real year of production for the Sun Devils, where he ran for 1,000 yards and 15 scores last season. He's in your third tier, but I wonder how these NFL teams are going to see him.
Yeah. So with White, it's an older player, 23.7 next year when the season starts. But as you mentioned, JUCO transfer, only has one good season. His first season was really, at Arizona State was COVID. So didn't get a full sample of games, just like we didn't get with a lot of backs, which makes some of these guys tougher to look at because all of these stats are all based on you had to have at least played 5 games in the season for me to include you in the sample. And so for that COVID season, it really kind of wrecks, it creates some issues for the model. But if you look at not Brian Robinson, if you look at Rachaad White, the big thing really is, his availability in the receiving game, 16% target share last season for Arizona. That is really good. And a lot of times when we see these backs really play well as receivers in college, we see them carve out receiving roles in the NFL. Now, it doesn't always come through. The NFL is littered with examples of guys that had these huge receiving years in college that never came through. The Brian Leonards of the world. There's a lot of them that just never panned out. So this doesn't lock anything in for sure. But when you look at the rest of his data points as well, like the 36% of the yards in his best season, 41% best touchdown percentage, those things are all strong enough that honestly, like there's a tier there, but if you force me today to number those guys in that tier, I would have Rachaad White right after Spiller. And there's a chance that I was talking about that tier earlier. There's a chance that it's really Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, and then we have a tier with Isaiah Spiller and Rachaad White together, depending on what happens. If their draft capital gets close to one another, I could see a scenario where Rachaad White actually moves ahead of Isaiah Spiller, just because of some of the things we talked about. So late bloomer. But when he did bloom, like it was a really big boom in this last season. So you like to see that. Didn't do amazing at the combine, but really good. That broad jump and vertical 125 and 38 to go along with the 4.48 40-yard dash at 214 pounds. That's really good. I know one of the knocks will be age, but it doesn't really worry me. Some of these guys bloom, a little bit later. You'd prefer them to be younger, but let's just see where the draft capital goes on Rachaad White. He could end up being the third back on the board.
They're not getting a second contract anyways. They're running backs. Let's be honest here. All right, finally, we'll throw a couple of guys against the wall here, but I definitely want to get your thoughts on Brian Robinson Jr. of Alabama. It's a football factory. You're talking about Derrick Henry. You're talking about Mark Ingram. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They pump out elite players. He played 5 years for the Crimson Tide, and he finally got his chance last year to be the lead back, rumbled for over 1,300 yards and 14 rushing scores, showed off a nice skill set as receiver, 35 grabs, 6'1", 225. I kind of like him, Dwain, is like this complementary big back to a team with a smaller, shiftier lead back. If you think like the Chargers or the Saints, basically that Mark Ingram role, I think he could fit in great in one of those teams.
Yeah, like I mentioned a minute ago, I really put him he's kind of in that same tier as Zamir White and James Cook. Played with a lot of other really good players on his team, so you kind of got to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt when you pair that together with where he's mocking right now. But he's the one out of this group that I could see falling the most. I don't know that for sure he'll hang around here. I think a lot of that is predicated on, we know the NFL loves SEC running backs. We know the NFL really loves Alabama running backs. So I think a part of where we're getting this Brian Robinson going in this range really ties back to that. If any of these guys, is what I'm going to say, especially exclude Rachaad White, but if any of these other guys fall in draft capital, it's really going to hurt them in the model because they don't have the production. The production is the number one thing we're looking for, and you give them a bit of a discount because they played in more competitive backfields. But if all of a sudden say Robinson's a 5th round pick, not going to be near as interested. I need him to be a 3rd round pick or at least a really early 4th round pick. That's a lot better for his stock. And of course, landing spot will matter. Does he land behind another, to your point, some team, what if the Steelers, we just want somebody to go behind Najee Harris. He could land in a spot like that. But overall, Robinson, there's just not a ton to point to, didn't do anything to make us think differently at the combine. Average career explosive rush rate, pretty decent in his avoided tackles per attempt, but again, not super predictive as far as future fantasy success. And that yards per game, Best yards, touchdowns are all low. Again, highly competitive situation. He's one of the bigger backs in the class, 225 pounds, also one of the older backs at 23 and a half. He really needs to nail the landing spot and the draft capital, though, or he will definitely be moving down the board. Like, honestly, I like Pierre Strong and some of these other guys better. But again, the number one driver is draft capital in the model. So right now I'm trusting the mocks.
So, folks, if you want to dig in any deeper to Dwain's tiers, head over to pff.com. The article, I believe, is free, so you can see it. And if you want to get a subscription going forward, just use our promo code HUSTLE. Make sure you're subscribed to that YouTube channel. Search Fantasy Football Hustle. We're going to be doing stuff like this all off season long. Boy, it's just getting started out there, folks. It's going to be a lot of fun. Crazy things are going to be shaking out. I'm on Twitter at Drake Fantasy. Dwain is, of course, at Dwain McFarland. The show is at FF Hustle. Anything finally, Dwain, before we get out of here?
No, I just scrolled down so people can see, like, that next group is really, they had production similar to what we saw some of the guys in tier 2. Also, you'll notice in tier 5, you got a lot of younger guys. So, I mean, I'm going to just make a couple of quick call outs. Like, some of the more interesting guys to me are some of the guys down low that if all of a sudden they got draft capital, and if you look at their production profiles, so for example, looking at Kevin Harris, he's pretty much blue across the board besides the explosive rush rate and avoided tackles per attempt, but only going to be 21.8 years old. And this is tier 5 in his rookie season, 221 pounds, 126 broad jump, 38.5 vertical. So probably going to run a really good 40. Best touchdown share, 59%. Only 83 yards per game career-wise, but still, Harris is a guy that can move up if he gets the right draft capital. And then if you look one tier above, the tier 4 guys, those guys like Tyler Algier, even if you look at Pierre Strong, like, look at Pierre Strong, like that dark blue on the career explosive rate, 20%, avoided tackles per attempt, 35%. Then he did really well with the 40-yard dash, 10-yard split, broad jump, vert. He probably moved up in draft capital. Right now, the mocks are not, he's not in enough mock drafts to register. I think that's going to change. I think there's a really strong chance that Pierre Strong starts to move up. Will be the oldest back in the class at 25.1 years old. So yeah, you can check out more of that. And there is just the big faller, Kyron Williams, just really came out and ran poorly. 40-yard dash, 4.65, broad jump, 116, only weighed 194 pounds. So that's probably gonna hurt his draft capital. So he is actually the biggest faller. He was mocking around the 70s, fell all the way to 164 in the latest mock after the combine.
And the biggest riser, of course, you, the Fantasy Football Hustle listener, viewer. We thank you for joining us. And make sure you stick around all season long. If you're listening on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a nice review. And if you're not following us on a podcast platform, what are you waiting for? Jump in there. These are always available as a podcast as well. So for Dwain, I am Brian. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, folks, and we'll be back with you very soon. Remember, though, to never get out hustled. See you later, folks.